this actually links us back to my discussion of neoliberal ideas earlier. And it's essentially about technocrats reducing the power of the people and essentially ending up with an often anti-democratic push. I mean, you look at the neoliberal theorists, economic philosophers, and some actually really do want to take this out of the hands of the people and essentially put governance into the hands of technocrats, because there's an assumption that technocratic rule always produces the best results. This is about the regulatory state, which is seen as more impartial and rules-based, with experts, mainly economists, who essentially took over from the lawyers and political scientists of Keynesian times to produce a more technocratic governance that was also much more difficult to understand by the people, if you will, with its own language, etc. So there are two main problems with the assumptions of sort of neoliberal technocracy. I think we should call it that. It produces the best results, which, as we've seen, is not the case. And the second is that it works in a democracy, in democracies, and it works for democracies. And what we've seen over time is that people have become increasingly alienated and disaffected because they see governments, their own, and here we can talk about Latin America as well as Europe, and also the European Union, if we're talking about Europe, as not sufficiently politically responsive. Increasingly, governments of the center right and the center left did exactly the same thing. It's Tweedledum, Tweedledee. So it actually makes perfect sense, as we heard from Kenneth earlier, it makes perfect sense that there's a move toward the extremes on the right and on the left, to populist extremes with easier answers, with a rejection of experts. In particular, when we see that they actually didn't do the right thing, they didn't produce the results that kept being promised. I, of course, also see this as a problem of legitimacy and democracy, especially in Europe at the European Union level, where technocratic rules even further removed policymakers from the kind of democratic checks and balances and control that you are more likely to have at the national level. But more generally, technocratic depoliticizes decision-making. It takes it out of the hands of political leaders who are politically accountable to the citizens, and puts decisions in the hands of independent technical officials or technocrats who are often given autonomous authority to decide. Now, part of the reason for that, of course, is that there's a neoliberal assumption that all politicians are self-interested rent seekers, and that's right, but will do so impartially. Obviously, I don't like to knock experts entirely, because we are all experts here, but I mean, what the failure is to see that the move toward technocracy reduces democratic control over policy. And there's an assumption that policy is neutral, but of course it's not, as Nicolás was clearly telling us earlier. But I mean, what's interesting about all of this, that neoliberalism, in some ways, we're all neoliberals now. Neoliberalism has become so accepted as a background philosophy that there's an assumption that there's only one way to do things. It's kind of TINA. There is no alternative in Margaret Thatcher's terms. So now to move toward the Eurozone crisis, what happens in the Eurozone crisis? And here, Cristobal, I would like to blame politicians as well as technocrats, because in a way it's the politicians who chose a kind of technocratic solution and an attempt to depoliticize decision-making in the Eurozone crisis. Oh no, we're not making the decision, it's the experts who are deciding. It's the technocrats. But in fact, it is the politicians. So I think there's shared blame here.